go through our normal review first. So go ahead, Ronnie.
Penicky.
There you go. That's all right.
You were going there.
That's all right.
Genesis.
Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Very good. What's the next section?
History.
You go.
Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel,
First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles,
Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job,
All right. What's the next section?
history,
Wisdom,
wisdom,
Yeah. Now, what did you say?
Job,
Mm-hmm.
Psalms, Proverbs,
Ecclesiastes,
I figured I'd give you that one.
Song of Solomon,
All right. What's the next section?
major prophets,
Very good.
Isaiah, Jeremiah,
Jonah.
and Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel,
Very good. What's the last section?
Minor.
Minor prophets.
Hosea, Joel, Amos,
Obadiah,
Jonah.
Bishop,
Yeah.
Mike,
starts with an N. That's it.
Nathan. All right.
Habakkuk,
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 There you go. Habakkuk. First of Z's.
Z,
Zephaniah,
There you go.
Habakkuk,
No, we just did that one. This is the other H.
H, J,
It's pronounced like. Hey, guy.
hi.
Hey, guy.
Hey, yeah.
Hey, guy. The other Z.
Zechariah,
And what did we go over last week?
Malachi,
Malachi. Not pronounced Malachi. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to just do a review. And some of these questions are going to go back, it's going to go back a while. Just to see if you can remember some of these things. These are not too difficult questions, but just see where you are with this. And, this first question, I scattered them throughout, but thought maybe you might, I took one of these first to see if you could get it, because we've done this one fairly recently. Let's see if y'all can figure it out. Which prophet told the people to work on the house of the Lord instead of their own?
Jeremiah.
Remember this prophet made the comment, he said, why are y'all living in your paneled houses and ignoring the house of the Lord that's in shambles? I'll give you a guess, or I'll give you a hint. One of the minor prophets.
Hosea?
Nope. But it is an H.
Hey, yeah.
There you go.
Back to the elimination.
There you go. Remember, it was in Haggai that he was talking about how they had ignored, they were putting their own needs above the house of the Lord and the needs of the temple there. All right, so see if you can get this one. In what book do we learn about the life of Israel's greatest king? All right, this might be helpful. Who was Israel's greatest king?
David.
David. All right, so what book do you read about his life?
Psalms.
Huh?
Psalms.
He did write a lot of songs.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this records his life and circumstances, him being king. And if I was somebody that came out and said, now,
Samuel, First Samuel,
you're real close.
Second Samuel.
He was real hot.
Real close.
Yeah, he was hot.
Real close.
Yeah,
Hey, a grenade blows up. Why should get everybody right around it?
that's right. So, just remember that, if somebody who doesn't really have much of the knowledge of the Bible, these seem like mundane questions or things that really aren't important, but if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I don't really know that much about the Bible, but I'm interested in learning about this David guy. Where do I look? Now, if you just go open up the Bible and you start looking for David, somebody that has no idea. So it's important to know where to look. Even if you don't know the exact chapter or verse, at least you can point them in a general direction. And so whenever you get talking about the kings, there's a general section in the Bible. That's why I wanted you to learn the sections. Now, what section, this is a side question, but what section do you find this book in?
History.
You find it in history. So, all right, so you've got it narrowed down to a general location. Now, if you can just remember where it's at within that place, and there's only a few spots, there's only a few books that talks about David within that, so you can narrow it down even further. And you can tell somebody, said, this is where you can find it. All right, let's go. You going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say something. I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut you off. All right, so the next question is this. What king allowed his queen to write an edict to help her people?
Let's see, it was Esther that the one you're talking about.
Esther is the right queen. Who was the king? You know what book it's in, so you can find it if you needed to. It's, King Xerxes. That's the king that's in that. So I didn't know if y'all remember that or not, but if you know, at least you know what book it's in, because there ain't but one story in the Bible like that. So you should know where that's at. All right. Let's see if we can get the next one here. What is one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century? Biblical discoveries.
The
Dead Sea Scrolls?
I knew that's what you was going for. Fred read your mind. The Dead Sea Scrolls are, in fact, probably the greatest biblical discovery of the 20th century. I don't know many more things that could be more profound than that, but maybe perhaps the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, you read my mind.
That might be the only thing of greater significance, but anything that we find today that validates the Bible, which we know it does. Every time we find something, it just validates something else. So, looking forward to what that next big discovery is.
Amen.
All right, let's see what the next question is. All right, I've tried to word this one so maybe you get it. This book consists of 66 chapters like the Bible and can be broken down into two parts. Chapters 1 through 39 read like the Old Testament, and chapters 40 through 66 read like the New Testament. Remember, we spent a little while on this because of the parallels that this book and the Bible itself has in common.
Oh, Ezekiel,
No, but you're in the general location. You're in the right section. What section is that in?
Isaiah?
There you go. The book of Isaiah. Remember, the book of Isaiah is made up of 66 chapters. How many books of the Bible are there?
60.
66. All right. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah read like our Old Testament does. How many books are in our Old Testament? 39. The last 27 chapters of Isaiah talk about the Messiah, the restoration of the kingdom, and talk a whole lot like the New Testament. So
Which book of the Old Testament has got the most prophecy in it? Ezekiel?
I don't know which one has the most.
Well, I'm saying, it's got more of what to come about Jesus' when Jesus arrives.
Zechariah is pretty. That is a very messianic book. Zechariah speaks of Messiah more than any other prophetic book in the minor prophets, and maybe many of the major prophets as well. Daniel also speaks. The last several chapters talks more about the end times.
I used to read the Daniel and Revelation. You understood one, it's easier. You read Daniel first, it's easier to understand Revelation, like they were so similar.
I think it's a good practice to study both of those, but what I find is a greater practice is including the rest of the Bible in that study, because you can't rightly understand Daniel or Revelation without actually studying the rest of the Bible, because there's a lot of history that's like a lot of historical illustrations, there's a lot of historical symbolism that if you know some of those things, they help you understand some of the minor details and some of the major details that you'll find in Revelation and Daniel. So it's I think that's where people mess up, is when they study Revelation, they tend to stay there. But if you'll pick up the rest of the Bible, it'll help you immensely. A lot of things will help you there. But Isaiah has Isaiah might speak more about the Messiah, about predictions, things that have been fulfilled, probably more than any other one. And we do know that Isaiah is mentioned more than any other prophet in the New Testament. He's the most quoted prophet in the New Testament.
More than Jeremiah?
Yeah. Yeah. Isaiah is quoted a lot in the New Testament. But it's just, it's uncanny how the book of Isaiah resembles the Bible as a whole. 39 chapters and 27 chapters and 39 books and 27 books. It's pretty crazy. But it's that's just a fun little factoid for you, but you know, just something to help you out there as you're reading it. So this next question, this goes way back. Way back. Who are the patriarchs?
Moses,
Go back further.
What do you know?
Jonah,
Abraham?
Abraham,
Yeah.
Yeah, Isaac, a lot.
Isaac,
Isaac,
there's one more. Who was Isaac's son? Or who was one of them?
Jacob.
Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are considered the patriarchs. The patriarchs would be whenever you read in the New Testament about the fathers, or specifically the father of the Hebrew nation, Abraham is listed as the father of the Hebrew nation. Remember when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and they were exclaiming that Abraham was their father, and they were trying to say that the devil was Jesus' father. He told them, he said, no, he said, I know who my father is. And he said, Father Abraham's not your father either. He said, no, he said, the devil is your father. But yeah, if somebody came out and said, hey, I want to learn about the patriarchs, I want to learn about the beginnings of the Hebrew people, the patriarchs, the father of the Hebrew nation, then this is where you should go. Now, here's a follow-up question to this one. Where do you find them?
in the Old Testament.
That narrows it down. Can you narrow it down anymore?
Let's see, Genesis.
All right, Genesis, very good. Can you narrow it down more? Because Genesis has 50 chapters in it. It's a pretty long book. Remember, Genesis is pretty much broken down into 3 sections. And there's a large section dedicated to the patriarchs.
Middle section.
It would be the middle section. That's good. That's a good educated guess. Chapters 12 through 36. Because at the very, very end of chapter 11, we read about Abraham's father, Terah, and Abram. Well, it would have been Abram then.
I think
And
with
then-
Abraham had the same
Yeah.
person,
and
father,
then-
son, so I
Yeah.
don't remember how it was, though. It
Yeah.
added on letters and made it longer or something like that.
Yeah. It was basically a portion of the title of God was included in Sarah and Abraham's name. That so it's Abraham. So the Abram and the was included in there to like give it a part of God's name. So that came later after he made the covenant with Abraham. Or after he made the covenant with Abram and changed his name to Abraham. But this is where you find it. Chapter 12, that begins really telling the narrative and the events of Abraham and his beginnings, and then all the way through the covenants that he made with him, and then the covenants that he made with Isaac and with Jacob. And so it was, I don't think I had this question included, but Jacob had how many sons?
Three.
How many tribes are there in Israel?
12.
12. All right.
12 sons.
All right. So, whenever you're talking about one of the sons, who was the son who got put out by the brothers? Joseph. The last chapters 37 through 50 talk about Joseph. So, Joseph takes up a pretty good portion of the end of Genesis. That's where you'll find the blessings. That's where you'll find the blessings given to the kids and all that stuff for Israel. So that's where you find the beginnings of the 12 tribes of Israel. So if somebody asks you about that, you can direct them there. All right. Which king was the last to rule a united Israel?
Solomon.
Very good. King Solomon. I guess if you wanted to get super technical, he wasn't the last one, but his son, because of how he acted, there wasn't a united Israel very long when his son took over. But this was the last substantial or any timely rule over the united state of Israel was when King Solomon had it. Now this next question is pretty important when you start talking about history in general, the history of Israel and things like that, so I hope you'll get this one. Which world superpower destroyed Judah in 586 BC? Babylon, the Babylonian Empire. That was the kingdom that destroyed Judah and destroyed the temple, destroyed everything. So that's a pretty important date because there's a lot of things that hinge on that date and in and around that date. So there's just your little picture of the Babylonian Empire. Now, what is the 400-year period called when God sent various leaders to help Israel? It's been a long time since we've been in that book.
Does it have to do with Exodus, since that's where you're exiled?
It would be after Exodus. There's a specific time where the people of Israel really had no
Leadership.
They didn't have any leadership like Moses or Joshua. And so God rose up several of these in that time frame to help Israel. I'll give you a hint. Today they preside over court cases.
Judges.
Judges. Remember, God rose up several judges during that 400-year period to help Israel every time they would fall. So if somebody want to know what time frame the judges fell in, that's something you can tell. All right. What is the Greek translation of the Old Testament? Septuagint. Very good. Or also known as the LXX, Roman numerals, or 70. That was the reason it's called the LXX or the 70 is because of the Jewish population was expanding all over northern Africa and Alexandria, Egypt. The leaders there commissioned some Jewish scholars to take the Hebrew language and translate it into the Greek because Greek was the predominant language of the entire empire and nation. So that's what they did. So we have the Septuagint. What were the two kingdoms under the divided kingdom called?
Judah is.
Judah and Israel. Do you remember, other than that, do you remember
Northern and Southern.
northern and southern?
Yeah.
Which one was the northern kingdom?
Judah
No,
is.
The northern kingdom was called Israel, the southern kingdom was called Judah. That's important, because remember, that's important that as you're reading through the prophets, some of the prophets spoke to both nations. Some of the prophets spoke to one or the other, but as you're reading, sometimes, especially with Isaiah, because he'll jump back and forth between them, as you're reading it, if you're not paying attention, especially in a Bible that doesn't give you subheadings, I think most Bibles today will give you a subheading, so you kind of got an idea of who the prophet is talking to, but some of the Bibles don't have headings, and if you don't understand when they jump back and forth between Judah and Israel, you might think they're talking about the same place. But in fact, it was two very different kingdoms, two different agendas. God blessed one more than the other, and it had an impact on how they were treated as well. So it's a pretty important piece of information when you're studying all that.
Did they fight amongst themselves?
Yeah.
A lot.
They did. Yeah, they did. This book is a collection of praises or hymns by various authors. There you go, the book of Psalms. And a good book it is. What are the main differences between the book of Kings and Chronicles? Now, if you read them, there's a lot of it that's exactly the same. It seems very redundant, but there is one stark difference
One is
between the two.
the view of the northern kingdom, the other is the view of the southern kingdom.
You're really close. You're really hot there. You want to take another guess?
Well, Judah and Israel. I don't know.
You're really close. The book of Kings talks about the northern and southern kingdoms, kings, Israel's and Judah's. The book of Chronicles only talks about the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom. That is the biggest difference between those two, even though there is so much similar in there. So as you're reading those two, that's the difference. So if anybody ever asks you the difference, there you go. All right? You got it? All right. See if we can get this one. What are the original languages of the Bible?
Greek, Hebrew,
Hebrew,
You got two of them. There's one more.
Greek.
Greek,
No, Greek and Hebrew.
Aramaic.
Aramaic. There you go.
No.
There's some small portions in a few books or a couple books that have Aramaic. Daniel's one of them, and I want to say, I'm trying to think of the other one. I want to say it's either Esther or Ezra. One of them have Aramaic, but I know Daniel. There's a good little portion of Daniel that's in Aramaic. But those are the original languages. I'm very glad that nobody said Old English, because that was not the original language. All right, very good. You did good. All right. If we wanted to study origins, where would we find it? Now, what does origins mean? If I wanted to find the origin of anything, where do I start? Do I start at the end, the middle,
Genesis.
the beginning? All right.
They started.
All right. Now, when I talk about origins, the beginnings of all things.
The foundation,
That's where it
Well,
started.
that
Where it started.
has the world always existed?
no,
Has the heavens always existed?
no.
No. So where do we find? There's a section in Genesis that deals nothing but with the origins of everything.
In the beginning,
The beginning.
Beginning of Genesis.
All right. You know what chapters? You know at least chapter 1.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Fred got he said the middle part a while ago. So if that was the middle part from chapters 12 to 36, then what's the first part? It has to be chapters 1 to what?
11.
11. That's where you find origins. Origins of the Bible, origins of everything are right there in chapters 1 to 11. All right. This book describes the rebuilding of the temple. Not the building of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple. I probably should have added down there, this book describes the rebuilding of the temple after the captivity.
Would it be Daniel?
Esther, Esther,
No, it's not Esther, but it starts with an E.
Ezekiel?
Ezra.
Ezra. There you go. The book of Ezra. Because remember, he was the first, they were in that group, that first group that came back and was allowed to leave and come back and rebuild the temple. And then there was another group that came later. We'll get to that question later. What book records the conquest of Canaan?
Joshua,
Very good, Joshua. Because remember, at the very end of Deuteronomy, they're at the eastern border, about to cross into the promised land. And what did God tell them? Y'all got to go in and take this land, and I'm going to help you. And the book of Joshua covers that conquest.
Right before they crossed the Jordan.
No, that's at the very beginning of Joshua. The conquest happens after they cross the Jordan.
Okay.
All right. This book's main point is that life without God is meaningless. And I put that meaningless in there because that word was used over and over again in that book. Another phrase you might recognize is vanity. Vanities of vanities. It was used over and over again in that book. Any guesses?
I think the book of Proverbs tells you about how you live life today. Like the way it tells you to do things.
You're in the right section. It's not Proverbs, but you're in the right section.
Ecclesiastes,
Ecclesiastes. Same author.
Yeah.
Book of Ecclesiastes. Remember, if you go
See, your
through,
neck blows up everything, we're covered.
if you go through and read Ecclesiastes, that's one thing that the author goes over and over again. Remember, he talks about how he had everything under the sun, and it was all meaningless. Because the stuff that he was doing with it wasn't glorifying God. Remember, he said there's nothing new under the sun. You know, he talks about the vanity of vanities. He talks about how meaningless life really is, except for the fact of having God. That's the only really meaningful thing in this life. All right? What book describes the tabernacle and many laws?
Leviticus,
Leviticus, very good. Remember, the book of Leviticus talks about the priesthood, talks about all the Levitical laws, talks about the tabernacle and its building and all the different ceremonies and rituals that had to take place. The highest concentration of laws are found in Leviticus. All right, so here's another important question. Which world superpower destroyed Israel in 722 BC?
Rollins?
Assyria,
The Assyrian Empire. Very good. Remember, Assyria, this was their land, and Babylon came in and took over Assyria, and then came down and took over Judah. Very important because Isaiah was prophesying during this time. So some of your other prophets were prophesying during this time. This prophet reluctantly preached to the Ninevites.
Jonah.
Jonah. Well, I didn't want to put he got swallowed by a whale. I thought that would be too easy.
You think we got that?
Which world superpower ruled during the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther?
Persian.
The Persian Empire. And they ruled a vast empire. Remember, it was Syria, Babylon, and then Persia. This prophet wrote a book of laments. That word gives it away.
Lamentation.
Jeremiah.
Remember, Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. Laments, woes, sorrows. All right? Where do we find the Ten Commandments?
Genesis.
Exodus. All right? We need to know where we can find them. All right? So if somebody says, okay, do you know what chapter they're in? What chapter do we find the Ten Commandments? Because Exodus is a pretty long book too.
It is.
You got 10 fingers and 10 toes. How many does that come out to? 20. Exodus 20. All right, that's where you find the Ten Commandments at. Now, this one's a little different. Can you list the Ten Commandments?
I love that God with all their heart.
No. No, that was the
That was
greatest
the-
commandment. That was what Jesus. Actually, that's Old Testament.
Also has no other
But
God.
Jesus, he simply went back to the Old Testament.
Don't have any other God before me.
You shall not have no other gods before me. Very good. Now the second one is very similar to it.
Not having graven images?
Yep. You shall not make and worship any idols. Now, this is kind of paraphrased there, but that was what it was. I think in some translations this says graven images, so that was correct.
Love the mother and father.
Let's see.
So down.
That was a pretty important one.
Take the Lord's name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the next one is pretty important because
The Sabbath day, keep it holy.
yeah. Now the next one I think is what Ronnie was talking about.
Honor the parents.
Yeah. Honor your father and your mother. Okay. What's the next one?
Shall not kill.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think this begins the you shall nots.
Not commit
They are-
adultery.
Yeah.
Should not commit adultery.
Shall not steal. Shall not bear false witness.
Yeah. What's the last one?
Shall not covet.
Neighbor's house.
You shall not covet. Now, this one here, I think, bears a lot of importance
Yeah.
in today's society because there's a lot of this that goes on high levels. But there's a lot of that goes on high levels. So, but anyway, that one there, I see that day in and day out. It's just, well, that one too. Well,
Well, the joke about that, Bob, that's why they take the Ten Commandments out of
Courthouse.
courthouses.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think one of the great, one that should be in there, that you fear your God with all your heart, you know. There's not enough fear of God
Mm-hmm.
in the world now.
That's a fact. Not gonna argue with you there. This prophet prophesied to a people God described as having hard foreheads, and God gave him a harder one. Now there were, I think at least 3 prophets that God said these people had hard heads, but there was only one. He said, I will make your forehead as hard as flint. Did you take a guess, Fred?
I started to say Jeremiah.
No. No, right section though.
Daniel?
Isaiah.
Nope. Y'all are all over it. Process of elimination. Let's see, you've already said what? Jeremiah, Isaiah, Daniel. Well, there ain't but one more in that section.
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel. God said, you're going to go and preach to this people. They got hard heads. He said, I'm going to make you one harder than flint. So that's in the first few chapters of Ezekiel.
We got a lot of prophets that way.
All right. Who was Israel's first king?
Saul.
King Saul. All right. This book contains a series of dialogues between family, friends, and God. There's not but one book that's laid out this way in the entire Bible. Anybody take a guess at it? Give up? The entire book is made up of a series of dialogues. Job talks to his family. Then his friends come in. And in there, Job talks to God. There are dialogues between each one of those. And it's almost written like a play, where when there's a scene, and then when one scene ends, there's another character that comes in. And the entire book's made up that way. Now, I hope you get this next one, because it's the only book in the Bible like this. This book contains a deeply erotic love story. What book of the Bible is nothing but a love story? Song of Solomon. Most Hebrew boys cannot read this book until they're 18 years old, because the Hebrew is very explicit. All right, you should be able to get this next one. This book is a collection of wise sayings. Proverbs. Very good. You didn't get that one, we're just gonna start all over. This prophet prophesied under two foreign powers.
Could be Moses did.
He was taken into captivity as a young man.
Daniel?
Daniel.
Daniel. Remember Daniel? He started under King Nebuchadnezzar, and then under Darius the Mede, and then under Cyrus. But Darius the Mede and Cyrus, they were both Persian. So those are, Daniel prophesied under those two foreign powers.
Because Daniel could interpret their dreams right and tell them what it meant. That's why they wanted to keep him alive.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just that. I mean, it's just, you know, if you read it, there were people who really liked Daniel. Obviously, there were people who didn't like him, but there were people who did and wanted to keep him around because he was a wise person. But Daniel had a lot of help from God. There was a lot of, I think God pulled at the hearts of some of these other foreign people to allow Daniel to stay there as well. There are various types of psalms. Can you name at least two of them? Remember when we went through the book of Psalms, there was a lot of different types of psalms. Can you name at least two kinds of them? Well, if you notice,
Praise.
All right, praises is one of them. Or thanksgiving, praise and thanksgiving psalms kind of fit in the same category. What is psalms? What are they?
Psalms.
Some,
Hymns.
hymn,
These are just some of them. Hymns, laments, thanksgiving psalms, messianic psalms, and imprecatory psalms. Anybody remember what imprecatory psalms mean? Psalm 73 is an imprecatory psalm. That's one that, it's one where the psalmist is looking around, sees the evil in the world, asks some questions about, you know, why is this going on? Why does it seem like the evil are prospering? But then comes around to the idea that God has not overlooked this injustice and asked God to take justice in his hands to punish those who are evil. So it's basically psalms of curses. You know, God cursed this nation for the evil that they're committing. That's basically what an imprecatory psalm is. It's recognizing that God can bring forth divine justice against evildoers.
That God has justice.
I just realized I made a mistake on this next question. It's supposed to say, I think I was typing something else and I got distracted or something, but I guess you can read it. Who was the prophet instructed to marry a prostitute? I guess that's still I guess a proper question. Probably should have worded which prophet was instructed to marry a prostitute. What but one? Hosea. Remember who he was told to marry? Gomer. Not Gomer, Gomer. Spell Gomer, pronounced Gomer. All right. Who is the queen who saved her people from total annihilation?
Esther.
Queen Esther. Very good. What book do we find the Hebrew people in bondage?
Exodus.
Exodus. Good. All right. What are the categories that are given to the prophets depending on when they prophesy? Remember, there was a significant event that took place, and depending on if that prophet prophesied before, during, or after, that's where these terms come from.
Prophecy of doom.
Huh?
Prophecy of doom.
Mhm. All right, I'll give you a hint. What was the event? What was the thing that happened to the people of Israel and Judah? What happened when the invaders come in and conquered them? What did they do with them?
The man of slaves.
Well, not only that, but did they leave them where they were, or did they take them somewhere?
So,
All right, so what's that called?
Bondage.
bondage.
Well, it's not bondage, and it's called, there's a word for it.
Concubine.
Exile.
Exile.
Oh, yeah.
And so whenever you're talking about certain prophets, then depending on where they prophesied in regards to the exile, then you can put them into three categories. You know what those categories are.
We're still doing it today. People going in exile.
And it's important to know these because it helps with the interpretation when you're reading these specific prophets. It helps to make sense of it. I'm going to start bringing the notebook with you. Writing some notes down. Does that ring a bell? Pre-exilic, exilic prophets, post-exilic prophets. I've talked about that many times.
I thought pre and post was the last one, because before or after, like I can't think of a middle name, middle word for the middle.
Yeah. So pre-exilic means they prophesied before the exile. Exilic means they prophesied during the exile, and the post-exilic means they prophesied after the exile. So if you know when the exile occurred, then you can pretty much figure out who prophesied when. All right, so here's what I want to do. Can you name at least one prophet from each category? So let's start with pre-exilic. Name one prophet who preached before the exile. And this is the biggest collection, so you can probably take a wild guess and you might get it right.
Oh, Abraham.
No. We're talking about prophets here. Prophets. Remember we went through major prophets and the minor prophets?
Jeremiah.
Ezekiel.
Jeremiah was one of them. All right. So there's your pre-exilic prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Those are your pre-exilic prophets. All right. Who was your exilic prophets? There's not two of them. There's only two prophets who preached during the exile.
Daniel,
Daniel was one. Can you think of them? Daniel and Ezekiel, those are the only two prophets who preached during the exile. Because remember, both of them were taken during the exile. They were taken by Babylon back to Babylon. So that only leaves 3 prophets for the post-exilic.
Hezekiah.
Huh?
Hezekiah.
Hezekiah is a person, not a book. He was a king. He was a good king of Israel, Judah, for the most part. His last few years was a little rough, though. For the most part, he was a good king. What's the last 3 books in the Minor Prophets? That's one.
Malachi,
Malachi, what's the other one?
Z-E-C-H.
Zechariah. Those are your post-exilic prophets. That means they prophesied after the exile. All right, so it's important. That may not seem like an important fact, but it is important because as you read those books, understanding when they are preaching makes a huge difference as you're reading it because it gives you the context. And if you don't understand the context, you can get confused about what the prophet is actually saying and who he's saying it to. And so those are important things. It's more important than you think. All right. This book describes the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And on this one too, I should have said after the exile. You've already covered who rebuilt the temple. Who's that? Who rebuilt the temple? Or who led the charge to rebuild the temple? Ezra. So who came after Ezra? He helped rebuild the walls. Nehemiah. All right. Which prophet was the last to prophesy to the southern kingdom of Judah? Now, here's the thing. Now, if you know the dates, this can help you out. When did Babylon destroy Judah and Jerusalem? That's when the temple and everything was completely destroyed. That happened in 586 BC. All right? Who was the prophet who had been preaching during that time in Jerusalem and had talked to the priest, had talked to the king, had talked to the prophets, and he preached to them for like 20, 30 years. But he was not taken into exile. Jeremiah. That was the last prophet to preach to the southern kingdom of Judah. And that was the last question. Y'all did pretty good by and large. Well, some of that stuff we ain't covered in a long, long time. Because we had a long break in between one of those because of COVID and all that nonsense. But y'all did pretty good for the most part. But some of these things, you know, it is important to know. I know sometimes you don't think it is, but it is. Because, like I always say, the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us to be prepared to give an answer in any season and for any reason. And if we don't even know where stuff is in the Bible, how can we give an answer? How can we direct people to where things are in the Bible? It is not a good enough answer to just say the Bible says so. Even though that might be a fact, it's not a good enough answer because the Bible tells us that that is not a good enough answer. Because if that would have been a good enough answer, then the Bible would have said, well, just tell them the Bible says so. But it doesn't. So it's important to keep in mind, you don't have to know every small detail, because nobody's going to know every small detail. But some of these things, these are kind of minor details, but they have major implications. Like the exile. For the longest time, I remember, I'll give you an example. This is a real life example. I remember sitting, this was before I really started studying the Word and getting to the Word deep. I would hear preachers talk about this prophet prophesying to there, to there, to there, and it was so confusing to me. I just didn't understand how for me, it didn't make sense. But then, when I was looking at it and I started getting to the Bible, and I realized that there was a southern kingdom, there was a northern kingdom, there was a split, there was an exile, and then suddenly it started making sense. So, okay, well, I understand why that prophet was saying what he was when he was. Because if you read it and you put it in a different time frame, it just didn't make sense. And so when I started learning that, I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense now. And it was a minor thing, just knowing a single date and knowing what happened. So if you know what date the exile happened and what it was that happened, it can answer a lot of questions for you. And it can open up your eyes to things that you're reading in the Bible. And the same thing, if it was something that happened after the exile, knowing what the exile is and what happened afterwards, it makes more sense, puts more power into it. So it's important to know those things. Not only for yourself, but so you can help other people as well. Y'all got any questions about anything that we've covered? Maybe something we didn't touch on?
When God made Adam and Eve, what does the Bible mention anything that they was, what they were, or what, they were just people God made, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they wasn't Jews or anything, they were just people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Because I guess if you look at it, if you go back and you look at the origins, it's really more about almost like tribes, or if you look at basically the two lines that lead up to Noah, you have the Canaanites and the Sethites. So that's basically your line. And then after Noah and his family emerged from the flood, and then as they begin to repopulate the earth and as the population expands, and we get to the Tower of Babel, it's at that point where we start expanding, where we get into the different ethnicities. And I'm going to refrain from saying different races, because there's really no different races. Francis Collins, he did some phenomenal work on the Human Genome Project. where they took an extensive look at the information that's contained within DNA, and all of us are basically have the same DNA, that same genetic information. So we're, through that process, we are all one people.
But God made everybody different.
He made everybody different, and really the only difference between any of us is melanin, and that's the thing that makes us either darker or lighter. And that's just a genetic trait. It doesn't make us a different race, because our DNA is made up of the same elements. We have the same markers for the most part. We're all the same. It's just a matter of how much melanin we have. And then there's hereditary traits that come along with that as well. But I mean, it was a pretty phenomenal work that they did. Something, because what does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us there's neither Jew nor Gentile. The Bible tells us that we're all one people, we're all one race. And that's something else. That science, the Bible didn't validate science. The science actually validated the Bible. Because the Bible's always right. In our eyes, the Bible's always right. We don't really need to validate the Bible because we believe it's true. We believe it's inspired, and we believe God inspired these people to write it. So we believe what it says. But for those who need extra, the science proved the Bible. It actually validated what the Bible already says and what we already know to be true. But it was from that point, from there, that we started getting the different, where we started getting into the different tribal people, and expansion of the human race. And that's what God actually said. God had actually told them, as the population grew, to disperse. And they didn't do it. So that's why, at the Tower of Babel, that's why He confused them, so they would disperse. Because He'd already told them to do it.
God at the Tower of Babel, He just got tired of people. He just got tired of this people's stupidity. And that's when He changed the languages.
Well, if you go back and look at what He originally said, they were just being disobedient.
Well, same thing.
God told them to move away from each other.
Right.
And they wouldn't do it. So God had to do something to make them move away from each other. And when they couldn't understand each other, then they dispersed.
I thought something that I do with they're trying to build a tower of Babel, trying to build a way to heaven or something like that.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
To confuse the language and make it scatter out.
That's part of it. But the biggest thing is them just disobeying God in the first place.
See,
If they would have obeyed God in the first place, they would have scattered and we don't know how it would have turned out then because, we don't have that record, but that's what God had told them initially, is as you repopulate the earth, to scatter. But they didn't. They all stayed in one spot.
where was the Tower of Babylon? Was it in southern Israel or Jude? Where
No,
was it?
people don't really know, but a lot of people tend to think that it was somewhere in Iraq. But we don't really know for sure.
But you used to hear, like when I was a kid, we used to hear that all the time, they're trying to build a ladder all the way to heaven,
Yeah. Well, it's a multifaceted thing, but like I said, I guess the original sin of those people was not doing what God asked them to do to start with. Which isn't that always why we get in trouble?
Yeah.
Because we don't do what He asked us to do to start
Sin.
So, but anyway, next week we are going to talk about the time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So there was approximately 400 years that passed during that time. Most people refer to that time as the silent years, but they were not silent. It was a time full of a lot of history for Israel, for the Jewish people. That's when you see the Greeks during that time period. They come in and take over control from Persia. And then also during that time, you see the Romans come in and start taking power away from the Greek culture. And Rome kind of did things a little differently than other types of kingdoms. Generally, when a kingdom would come in and take over another power, they would typically install. They would boot away any of that people's influence and put their own on it. So like the Greeks would come in and make everybody learn their language and their art and their way of doing things, and do away with everybody else's. What Rome did, and they made it sound attractive, they were good salesmen. As they would come in and start to take over places, they would allow them to keep, or not really keep, but the Romans would absorb. Like say, the Greeks had a bunch of different gods. You probably went through Greek mythology at some point in school. You learned about Zeus and Apollo and, the different Greek gods. What Rome did, Rome had their own set of gods, and so they didn't completely do away with Greek's gods or any other gods. They just kind of absorbed them and kind of said, you know what? Said, well, maybe our gods are just a little more powerful, but we'll let you keep your gods too. And so that's why a lot of times when you start reading about Roman culture, that's why they call it Greco-Roman culture, because you still see that Greek culture. And at the time, Greek was the predominant language. That was the common man's language even during the Roman era. Because you had, like when you read when Jesus was crucified, and they put the plaque above his head, and they put it in 3 different languages. They put it in Latin, they put it in Greek, and they put it in Hebrew. And the reason they put it in those 3 different languages, Latin, that was the legal language. Greek, that was the common man's language. Everybody knew Greek. And Hebrew, that was for the Jewish people. So there was a reason why they was written in those 3 languages. But that's kind of how Rome did. They just kind of absorbed everything and said, ours is a little better, but we'll let you keep yours. As long as you as long as you play by our rules a little bit, we'll let you keep some of your stuff.
Right, that's what, like when Jesus went, they had the, right before he got crucified, they was letting the Jews have a little bit of say-so, and, but the Romans was really in control.
Well, the Romans, in a sense, they wanted peace. But in a lot of cases, it was peace through the sword. As long as you were doing what they said to do, everything was all right.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of the stuff leading up to the crucifixion and why the crucifixion happened. A lot of that was because they didn't want an uprising of the Jews, because it was festival time. There was more Jews in Jerusalem at the time than any other time of the year. The Caesar, the emperor was coming down, and so there was a lot of moving parts, to that. But it's a lot of history there to learn. It's interesting history.
But the reason the Romans failed, they were just too strung out. They had roads everywhere. Mm-hmm. And they tried to control everything.
Well, they spent more money than they had.
Yeah. Just like the United States.
Yeah, and when you look at the failures of the Roman Empire, there's a lot of similarities that the United States, we're heading down that same road. is we're outspending our tax dollars.
I thought for years that the United States was modern day Rome. We've grown too big, we try to go too far, we spend too much. I feel like we're in modern day Rome, I thought we're at the point.
Well, we're overextending. I mean, Rome was what, 200 years, and they failed,
Yeah.
and we're what,
245?
Something like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, we're in that cusp of when major superpowers typically fall. You know, they're in a 200 to 300 year span of about how long they last. I would say that, you know, we're a little different. Things that we do are a little bit different, but, you know, nothing lasts forever except for God. He's
Yeah.
eternal, and
As long as the Lord tarries.
we'll know what that's like one day. But anyway, that's all for today. Appreciate y'all going through this, and you know the work that you did, and seemed like y'all held on to or retained quite a bit of what we've covered, even though we hadn't covered some of it in a long time. So I appreciate that, and just keep learning. And you never know who you're gonna have to help, or might have to help. So that's all for today. Fred, would you close us out in prayer today?